Hello and welcome to Foreign Dispatches, the program that takes you around the world in 25 minutes. I'm Teniola Shoboale. On the program this week, first person charged under Hong Kong's national security law found guilty, plus scientists declare worldwide climate emergency. We begin in Hong Kong, where in a landmark ruling, the first person to be charged under the city's national security law has been found guilty. Tung Yin Kit was convicted after riding a motorbike into police and flying a flag calling for Hong Kong's liberation. More than 100 people have been arrested under the law since it came into force in 2020.
24-year-old Tung Yin Kit was found guilty of terrorism and inciting secession in the landmark case, which has long-term implications for how the legislation reshapes the city's common law traditions. He's the first to be charged under Hong Kong's national security law. An alternative charge of dangerous driving causing grievous bodily harm was not considered. Tong, a former waiter, is accused of carrying a flag with the protest slogan, "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times," and driving his motorbike into officers during a protest last July, shortly after the security law was enacted. The charges could lead to a prison term of several years to life. His sentencing will be announced at a later date. His trial tests the limits of free speech in Hong Kong, as prosecution and defense argue over the meaning of the slogan, widely used during the city's mass anti-government protests in 2019. Pro-democracy activists and human rights groups see Tong's case as a departure from Hong Kong's common law traditions, since he was denied bail and a jury trial.
At its broadest level, the national security law imposed on Hong Kong by the mainland authorities fundamentally undermines many of the rights that are still guaranteed to people in Hong Kong under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And by effectively putting forward this vague and overly broad law, the Hong Kong authorities now reserve to themselves the right essentially to prosecute any kind of speech that they or the authorities in Beijing don't like. Particularly, we are concerned about the establishment of national security courts, of national security police, and that these really undermine the ability of people to expect a fair trial, which has long been a real hallmark of the distinction between Hong Kong and Beijing.
The three judges at Tong's trial were picked by Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam to hear national security cases. Both Beijing and Hong Kong's government have repeatedly said the security law was necessary to bring stability back to the city, and assert that the rights and freedoms promised upon its return to Chinese rule in 1997 remain intact.
Well, it's been over a year now since China implemented the national security law in Hong Kong, aiming to crack down on months of pro-democracy protests. Pockets of activism still exist in the city today, with people regrouping behind an invisible front line that is harder to disrupt with tear gas and rubber bullets.
In a bustling shopping district in Hong Kong, Herbert Chow is walking a fine line. He's selling memories of the pro-democracy demonstrations that swept the city in 2019. Chow runs a chain of children's clothing stores called Cheeky Duck. But this particular shop, with its protest-themed t-shirts, stickers and pins, could cross the line into crime under the city's national security law. It was handed down by Beijing a year ago and could mean up to life in prison for what mainland China deems subversion, secessionism, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. Chow's shop has already been raided by police, but he says he's not budging.
I obeyed the law. I haven't violated the law. The red line of the national security law is always moving. If selling these products is considered inciting the public, if they dare to sink so low, I will fight to the end.
Chow says he still hopes for a democratic future, and he isn't alone. Independent journalist Jade Chung focuses her reporting on the city's most vulnerable. She says that over the past year, self-censorship has crept in, making interviewees and reporters more careful about what they say. But she also says she has no plans to stop.
I still hope to stay and make the city my ideal place. At least I can uphold values. I don't want the new practices to replace them.
Critics say the national security law is being used to chip away at freedoms and stifle dissent.
National security cannot be used as a blank check to override people's rights. And I think that, we've seen this in other parts of the world where states and leaders, bring out the idea of national security, bring out the idea of terrorism as these things that they can use as trump cards, essentially, to encroach upon people's ability and to enjoy freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly. If you look at the broad sweep of people who have been targeted by this law, I think it's clear that there does seem to be a political element to this, where there's some of these charges and prosecutions appear to be politically motivated and designed to curb political opposition and silence voices that the government doesn't want to hear and doesn't want other people to hear. We're calling on the United Nations, and particularly the Human Rights Council, but also the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to really look into the way in which national security, terrorism, and these other concepts are being used by the Chinese government more broadly to target and limit the enjoyment of human rights more broadly within China, including in Hong Kong.
Authorities have made certain songs and slogans illegal, and democracy books have been pulled from the shelves of public libraries. Like the shop owner and the journalist, filmmaker Kiwi Chow has his eye to the future, working on a documentary of the protests, he says, to preserve the memory.
If I really get arrested, I will find comfort in the fact that I'm being punished for carrying out justice, and so I'm at peace. If I've already passed the challenge of fear.
A former British colony, Hong Kong, was handed back to China in 1997, but under the one country, two systems principle, this was supposed to guarantee certain freedoms for the territory, including freedom of assembly and speech, an independent judiciary, and some democratic rights. But in June last year, Beijing passed a national security law. Since it was enacted, more than 100 people, including protesters, pro-democracy politicians and journalists, have been arrested under its provisions.
Away from Hong Kong, the list of extreme weather seen in just the last few weeks has been immense. Thousands of scientists have repeated calls for urgent action to tackle the climate emergency, warning that several tipping points are now imminent.
Scientists had long predicted such extremes were likely, but many are surprised by so many happening so fast, with the global atmosphere 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial average. The Paris Agreement on Climate Change calls for keeping warming to within 1.5 degrees. Experts warn that governments around the world will have to anticipate further extreme weather due to climate change. The death toll in Henan province, China, where a dozen people lost their lives in a city subway during intense flooding at the start of the week, now stands at least 56 people. The city of 12 million is still recovering from floods this week, during which it received the equivalent of a year's worth of rainfall in just a few days. The extreme weather in China comes after floods killed at least 160 people in Germany and another 31 in Belgium last week.
The flooding in Germany and the flooding in Henan, the heavy rain in both places, obviously has a connection through global warming. Okay, now, so the idea is this, that when you have an increase in the temperature of the atmosphere, you also have the increase in the water temperature. And so because of that, you will have a lot more evaporation of water going into the atmosphere.
And in India, experts say climate change has led to extreme rainfall, causing deadly flooding across western Maharashtra and other parts of India.
Due to the global warming, the moisture holding capacity of the atmosphere has increased in recent years. So as and when there is a low pressure area developing over North Bay of Bengal and moving across central part of the country, in its association, the quantity of heavy rainfall is showing an increasing trend. So as a result, in association with the low pressure systems, we are encountering the extremely heavy rainfall activity, especially over central part of country, starting from Odisha to Maharashtra and Gujarat.
Downpours lasting several days have flooded cropland and forced authorities to move over 230,000 people to safer places, while major rivers are in danger of bursting their banks. The World Meteorological Organization, WMO, says water-related hazards dominate the list of disasters in terms of both the human and economic toll over the past 50 years.
According to WMO's Atlas of Mortality and Economic Losses from Weather, Climate, and Water Extremes, of the top 10 disasters, the hazards that led to the largest human losses during the period have been droughts, with 650,000 deaths, storms, 577,232 deaths, floods, 58,700 deaths, and extreme temperature, 55,736 deaths. With regard to economic losses, the top 10 events include storms and floods. The data shows that over the 50-year period, weather, climate, and water hazards accounted for 50% of all disasters, 45% of all reported deaths, and 74% of all reported economic losses at the global level.
Thousands of scientists have repeated calls for urgent action to tackle the climate emergency, warning that several tipping points are now imminent. The researchers, part of a group of more than 14,000 scientists who've signed on to an initiative declaring a worldwide climate emergency, say governments had consistently failed to address the overexploitation of the earth, which they describe as the root cause of the crisis and extreme weather being experienced around the world.
Across western United States, dozens of wildfires are actively burning, charring large swathes of land in recent days. Some are threatening thousands of people who live and work just a few miles away.
The Bootleg Fire, one of more than 80 active wildfires that have charred about 1.3 million acres in recent weeks, has ravaged the southern Oregon community of Sycan Estate, leaving behind a trail of ash-covered debris. Residents like Gage Clark, who evacuated ahead of the wildfire, returned to their community only to find their homes and businesses gone, their possessions destroyed.
I thought I still had my sawmill shop and possibly this shop. So I came back thinking that I still had something to come home to, and when I got here I was actually kind of gut shot, you know. It was knots in the stomach, and I mean, there's nothing left.
Local news reports said the fire had decimated 112 homes and 169 outbuildings. The Bootleg Fire, in Oregon's third largest wildfire on record, dating back to 1900s, located about 250 miles south of Portland, the fire had ripped through more than 400,000 acres of drought-parched brush and timber as of Friday, destroying at least 67 homes near the California border. At its peak, an estimated 2,000 people were displaced by evacuations. While the fire spread has slowed in recent days, officials also reported that ground crews are battling an outbreak of COVID-19, with at least 9 firefighters quarantined so far. Meanwhile, officials say the swarming Dixie Fire in California has gained ground and was only 21% contained as of Sunday morning. Crews and officials battling a large fire that has incinerated more than 190,000 acres in northern California brace for the possibility that smoke columns could spawn lightning storms capable of igniting more blazes. Conflagrations in the U.S. West, marking a heavier than normal start of the wildfire season, have coincided with record-shattering heat that has baked much of the region in recent weeks and caused hundreds of deaths. Scientists have said the growing frequency and intensity of wildfires are largely attributable to prolonged drought and increasing bouts of excessive heat that are symptomatic of climate change.
The long-awaited Tokyo Olympics is ongoing, but it looks a lot different than previous years. That's in a moment. Please stay with us. You're still watching Foreign Dispatches on Channels Television. The long-awaited Tokyo Olympics is finally ongoing, but after being delayed due to the pandemic, the event this year looks extremely different than that of previous years. For one, there are no spectators, and even the opening ceremony, normally a star-studded display, was very different, with fewer than 1,000 people in attendance. Take a look.
The Tokyo Olympics, like no other, opened on Friday, July 23rd, with fireworks illuminating an empty stadium and a moment of silence to honor those lost to COVID-19. Postponed for a year, organizers were forced to take the unprecedented step of holding the games without fans, as the novel coronavirus is on the rise again, taking lives around the world. Even the opening ceremony, normally a star-studded display teeming with celebrities, was eerily silent, with fewer than 1,000 people in attendance.
Greece! Girisha!
Regardless, it marks a coming together of the world with an audience of hundreds of millions around the globe, and at various stages of the pandemic, tuning in to watch the start of the greatest show in sport. The world's number 2 tennis player and one of Japan's biggest celebrities, Naomi Osaka, had the honor of lighting the Olympic cauldron. And highlighting the impact of the pandemic on the athletes and people around the world unable to see the Olympics in person, a lone female athlete ran silently on a treadmill. Then dozens of dancers moved about while projection mappings showed connections between them. The giant wooden rings were carried onto the field on a platform guided by the light of many paper lanterns. With a pull of a rope, the rings were transformed into the Olympic symbol.
Dear Olympic friends, welcome to the Olympic Games Tokyo 2020. Today is a moment of hope. Yes, it is very different from what all of us had imagined. But let us cherish this moment. Finally, we are all here together.
United States of America!
And then a vastly smaller number of athletes marched in the team's parade. The ceremony was marked by high-profile absences, including former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who wooed the Games to Tokyo. A number of top sponsors and economic leaders also stayed away. Only 15 global leaders were in attendance, along with Japanese Emperor Naruhito and US First Lady Jill Biden. Outside, hundreds of protesters carrying placards that read "Lives over Olympics" protested around the venue. The protesters, a mix of people in white surgical masks, yelled, "Stop the Olympics," as they marched. Only a third of the nation have had even one dose of vaccines, prompting worries the Games could become a super spreader event. More than 150 people involved with the Olympics have already tested positive. A strict playbook setting out rules to avoid contagion mandates frequent testing for the virus, restricted movements, and wearing masks by athletes and others in most situations. The Games will run until August the 8th. About 11,000 athletes from 204 national Olympic committees are taking part, along with a team of refugee athletes competing under the Olympic flag.
Even the way some athletes eat during the event is different, but it's not completely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The South Korean team has rented an entire hotel about 20 minutes drive to the Olympics village to cook food for its athletes separately and screen ingredients for radiation. Here's why.
At a hotel in Tokyo, chefs are busy preparing food for South Korea's Olympic team, completely separate from the cafeteria in the Olympic village that they'd normally eat at. Why the separation? It's not just COVID fears, but worries the food will be contaminated with radiation, according to the team's nutritionist, in what's turned into the latest saga in the long history of distrust between South Korea and Japan. An entire hotel has been rented for the endeavor, and 3 meals a day are delivered directly to the athletes. Inside the kitchen, there are manuals for sourcing and screening food, including the use of radiation equipment. The manual states that seafood, vegetables and fruits from 8 prefectures are banned, including Fukushima, the site of the 2011 earthquake and nuclear disaster. Hang Jong-suk has been the nutritionist for South Korea's Olympians for 35 years.
We've put more efforts in this time because of the coronavirus concern and because people are quite sensitive over the origin of ingredients such as those from Fukushima. Additionally, the weather here is very hot and humid, and we have to be extra careful of hygiene to prevent food poisoning incidents.
South Korea's decision to have an independent food program has prompted criticism on social media in Japan and among politicians. The country has previously irked Japan by curbing imports of Japanese seafood, citing safety concerns about Fukushima. South Korean athletes have welcomed the boxed meals. And although there may be little sign of relations easing between South Korea and Japan, athletes from both countries are not feeling the heat, at least over food. A Japanese Olympian Reuters spoke with said the South Koreans have been friendly and even shared their lunch with him, and that the problem has nothing to do with sports. It is not uncommon for countries to bring their own chefs to the Olympics either. The United States served its own food at the 2008 Beijing Olympics.
And finally, let's head over to New York in the United States to see how the world's most expensive French fries are made. They're $200 per plate, but are they worth it? You be the judge.
So are you happy with that? Can you see on that side? Yeah, that's good.
At $200 a plate, these are the world's most expensive French fries, according to Guinness World Records. But what makes them so special?
Truffle, truffle, and truffle inside these fries. So, in other words, we have truffle oil, we have the fresh black summer truffles. The Mornay sauce, in other words, it's a cheese sauce, is meant to be a dipping sauce, which is infused with truffles in 1,000 different ways too. So, truffle is the main star here.
New York City's famous Serendipity 3 restaurant uses high-quality chipperbeck potatoes, which are fried in pure goose fat, which is said to offer an earthy, nutty flavor with complexity and depth. And then the fires are topped off with 23K edible gold dust.
So it's a thrice cooked process. So we do a first blanch inside Dom Perignon and a French champagne vinegar. We'll cool it down, and then we will then do the first fry, which is at 325 degrees, and then we will cool that down and finish it off at 375 degrees. So this process is really going to ensure that it has a crispy exterior and a fluffy interior.
The dish is the restaurant's 10th Guinness World Record.
This is our 10th. We have everything from the world's largest wedding cake, the world's most expensive ice cream sundae, the world's most expensive burger, the world's largest cup of hot cocoa. We've done a lot. Well, Serendipity is really a happy place. People come here to celebrate, to really escape the reality of life sometimes, and have fun. And we're all about fun, and we have been for almost 67 years.
Serendipity was closed during the COVID-19 pandemic, and authorities thought the fancy French fries would be a good way to announce the restaurant's return.
Well, this is where we say goodbye till next time. Remember, our top stories are never far away. You can catch them on channelstv.com. Thank you so much for watching the program. I'm Tenyola Shoboale. Stay safe.